the term biodegradable doesn't actually mean anything. It's kind of an industry greenwashing, unfortunately. So biologically degradable was sort of a little bit, try to demarcate that. And what that really means is when something degrades, the carbon in the material, in the plastic or, whatever the product is being converted into CO2 or other gases. And so it's like degrading it rather than a traditional plastic made from hydrocarbons is like fragmenting usually. So it's just like breaking into smaller and smaller pieces.
Hey, what's up, everybody? We got Tim Silman of Lonely Whale on the podcast today. We had a really long conversation about Lonely Whale, some of the things that they're doing, how they're helping eliminate ocean waste and plastic pollution through some of their innovations, some of their partnerships. But we had such a long conversation that I'm going to break this up into 3 episodes. So if you want to learn about Lonely Whale, what they're doing, who they are, a little bit of background on some of the issues that we're dealing with ocean plastic, episode 1 is for you. If you want to talk about innovation and campaigns that they're doing and how they're helping promote sustainability with their Tom Ford Prize, all the other things that they're doing as a company, then you got to check out episode number 2. Episode number 3 is everything else, designing for a sustainable future, how you design packaging when you consider plastics, materials, logistics, and helping you as a creative understand some of the questions maybe you should be asking if you're not asking them already, maybe as a brand, what things you should be looking for when you're trying to commit to different target dates. I know all the brands are talking about hitting 2025, which is in just a few months. None of them are going to hit it. So the question that you should ask yourself and how to get there. And if you're a designer, how to work with brands to help them achieve what these goals are and really set some realistic dates. So it's up to you. This is like a choose your own adventure. You can listen to episode 1, 2, 3, or all of them. Regardless of what you do me a favor in the comments. Let me know what you think of this new format where we're kind of breaking it down into specifics to make it a little bit easier for you to consume. Also, if you've got any questions about Lonely Whale, sustainability, plastics, materials, packaging design, leave those in the comments too. Do me a favor. Above all, subscribe to the channel. Let's get to the show. How is Lonely Whale helping change the way that people are viewing plastic?
Well, I think we have a number of different initiatives that target this. I mean, and just to give you some like historical context, we have three key pillars of our work. One is like programs and campaigns. I mentioned this sort of like marketing and things, and this sort of, so that's part of that. We started with again, leveraging kind of making things cool, right? Like modern marketing. So we had the Stop Sucking campaign.
I'm Kendrick Sampson and I suck. We suck together.
Sure, I've sucked, but Yuna sucks even more.
Yuna sucks.
And I suck.
And literally had like these PSAs on YouTube and on social media saying like, celebrities saying like, I suck or like, stop sucking, right? So this message, trying to tap into this virality. And so we've run campaigns and Stop Sucking was focused on plastic straws. And we did a campaign called Hydrate, which was focused on plastic water bottles. And I currently run our Unwrap the Future initiative, which is focused on thin film plastic. And we can talk more about what that means in a second. The second component is Next Wave Plastics, which we co-founded with Dell Technologies, and we now convene with the Circulate Initiative, which is focused on integrating ocean-bound plastic into corporate supply chains. So you mentioned, I think before we started recording, about you talking with a company in Indonesia trying to integrate, and tackle the waste problem. So ocean-bound plastic is collected within 50 kilometers of a coastline in a country that doesn't have adequate waste management infrastructure. And so that's predominantly in Southeast Asia. So you use informal networks of waste pickers who are collecting these materials, and you're creating a pathway for them to be integrated into products and actually go from being a packaging to being like within the product itself, whether it's a computer or something else, like furniture, things like that. So that's our second initiative. Our third is our Ocean Heroes program. Started off as a boot camp in person, and then with COVID transitioned to more virtual programs. So more around empowering youth ocean advocates with a platform and resources. In terms of how we really try to like change that, make that shift, again, as I mentioned, like we're very much about this focused on collaboration. So I mentioned Dell, they've been one of our really long-term partners, and we have a whole host of other ones in our various programs. And so in the work that I've been doing, so focusing on thin film plastics. So in conjunction with Tom Ford, we launched the Plastic Innovation Prize, which was focused on finding scalable and biologically degradable solutions for thin film plastics. So thin film, it's primarily made from fossil fuels, low density polyethylene. Estimates are it's about 46% of the ocean plastic leakage every year is like flexible monomaterials, bags, wraps, things like that. So it's a huge, huge source of the issue with ocean plastic pollution. And it's, super thin, small, lightweight. It's like a ubiquitous, high volume, low value product. So the idea was like there was a number of companies and startups developing solutions, but we needed to identify them, vet them, and then try to partner them with brands. So we did a 2-year prize, did a global call for applications. We had 64 applicants from 26 countries and 6 continents. We then selected 8 finalists, and they submitted samples of their materials, which we then sent off for almost a year of testing with the University of Georgia's New Materials Institute and the Seattle Aquarium. So those tests were primarily focused on end of life of the material. So I mentioned biologically degradable. The term biodegradable doesn't actually mean anything. It's kind of an industry greenwashing, unfortunately. So biologically degradable was sort of a little bit try to demarcate that. And what that really means is when something degrades, the carbon in the material, in the plastic or, whatever the product is being converted into CO2 or other gases. And so it's like degrading it rather than a traditional plastic made from hydrocarbons is like fragmenting usually. So it's just like breaking into smaller and smaller pieces. The tests we conducted were kind of a mix of industry standard like ASTM, like seawater and soil degradation, as well as like much more novel stuff, like looking at for microplastics, doing really like using spectroscopy to look at the chemical signatures of the materials. So really like deep diving on the materials. Based on that and a bunch of other information the finalists submitted, we ended up with 3 prize winners. And they are in order Sway, Zero Circle, and Notpla, and they're based in the US, India, and the UK, respectively. They all happen to be using seaweed to make these plastic alternatives. And then that's been led off to a year-long accelerator program, also sponsored by Tom Ford, that is has been working to sort of scale those solutions. So it's been a mix of like traditional like venture capital type accelerator and this brand engagement component. So getting back to your original question. So we have 19 brands in this early adopter coalition. And so the idea was for each of these brands, we sort of do like a little bit of a deep dive is like, well, what does your supply chain look like? Where does thin film packaging show up? Like, is it just in poly bags? Like, what size are the bags? Do you have other, like garment bags, other things? Like, how are you, approaching your packaging? And where potentially could you test and trial these solutions? So they all committed to like attempting a trial, like a good faith effort. In some cases, the brand's kind of small. It's hard to kind of figure out how they test something in a meaningful way. But over half of them have been able to execute a pilot or a trial with our prize winners. And so that's been sort of our role is to facilitate those engagements. And so some of them have been, capsule collections with smaller brands like Noah, Le Club, and Florence have all done or are in the process of doing capsule collections, limited edition product runs with Sway to showcase their product, their packaging. And sort of talk about that publicly. For some of the bigger brands, it's really a process of like this. They have a much sort of more intensive R&D, evaluation process because they're really looking for something. They're much larger scale, right? So we're sort of helping to facilitate how they go about this and like navigating with the startup to help figure out how they work with a big corporate brand to switch to a more sustainable material.
Yeah, and that's the challenge, right? Is scale. And I know with my team, we do some work with the team over at Nopla, and like as they launch like new products or as they're testing new solutions, a lot of times as a creative, you're like, oh, this is so cool because you're seeing it somewhere. You're like, oh man, I want to create some kind of packaging or some kind of program with this product. You find out it's not at scale, so then typically you're like, all right, I'll move on to the next thing. But I think what's important is like if you're looking at some of these companies, figure out like what scale means to them, and do these capsule collections, do these like limited edition sets, because it helps get the word out that this is a new material that's available. I know like not only doing the the seaweed plastics, but now they're using the seaweed fibers to actually create board and additional things. Like it's really cool stuff, man. I mean, the look, and actually have some samples around here of some of the new board that just came out. As a creator, you can't limit yourself to the usual supply chain. You've got to test, you got to push. And I think it makes sense for a lot of the small brands because you won't have that large volume. But even if you're at a large brand, it's like swap in some of these materials, do like a limited edition piece, get the word out, brand it with Sway, brand it with Not Plug, continue to push this out, because at some point they'll grow and you're helping them grow. You're helping kind of push that solution forward.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, I think every brand has to determine like what their comfort level is and look what their ability to sort of undertake that is. And, look, I mean, I think as I mentioned, like we work with like some really amazing, like committed people, and it's just, they're in, right? Like their day to day is, they're just, they're packaging and shipping product and supporting, making sure it gets from A to B, from the warehouse or the 3PL to the customer in good shape. And when they open it, that they love it. But they recognize that that's kind of that status quo can't continue. And ideally, in most cases, their corporate parent has like set some targets for how they want to make that transition. But it's not easy, and I think that's the hard part. And so some brands really don't want to do capsules. It's hard. They really need something, kind of that is scalable. And when they say like, oh, we're looking at new solutions, it's basically like, well, we have factories in these, X number of countries and we're doing this many units a year. Like, what is your trajectory to meet that? And that's a big daunting challenge. And so I think for companies, it's really like, well, if you're startups, it's kind of figuring out what's your mix, right? Like, what's your mix of the pipeline of like small and like more immediate stuff, longer term things? Like, who do you have on the other side of the table that's really committed and is like a true believer in your mission? And I think for, designers, I think there is a role to play, really upfront to kind of design that in and advocate, whether it's on a capsule, right? If you're working at a brand that is in a position to do that kind of stuff and sees the value in it, like advocating for that. And if you're not, then thinking kind of long term and understanding what's the pipeline. How do you kind of think really at the upfront upstream stage of like how you design in these materials, right? Because I think the best materials, and all of our prisoners are designed to be like drop-in solutions to the existing plastics value chain, and that's I think really critical. But takes a lot of fine tuning and maybe some concessions in terms of like logistics, just to recognize that, plastic's a magic material. It's been around for like 100 years. It does a great job, but it's like over-engineered and the costs don't factor in all these other externalities. So you're going to have to kind of figure out how you triangulate and actually use them.
If anybody wants to learn more about Lonely Whale, I mean, they can go to lonelywhale.org. What else do you guys have that a creative can go and listen to or watch or learn?
All that stuff's on our social media, and you can go at Lonely Whale. Like us, we have about 400,000 followers on Instagram and have very, lean in pretty heavily on how do we communicate. And, I think I'm not a designer, but we have like these amazing creative thinkers on our team and designers that we work with from like a visual perspective to really create, compelling messages.
All right, that's it for the pod. You've listened to episode 2. Go back, listen to episode 1, and go forward and listen to episode 3. Thanks so much.